Top story this week, Black Friday came a day early in WWE. On Thursday, WWE released 11 talents, including one referee. So I figure we'll go through the list here of each person who was let go, give some thoughts on them. The biggest cut is the one that was kind of built up over the course of the day. I think the way it works is that they can't formally announce that you've been released until you've been notified and they've gotten you. It's almost like serving a subpoena to somebody. So I think JTG was either avoiding his phone or away from his phone or whatever the case was, but all day as people were being cut left and right, people were making fun. Oh, how is JTG still employed? He, survives the axe again, and then sure enough, the axe fell later in the afternoon when JTG was informed that in fact he too had been released, and so ends the employment of JTG, 7 years and 30 days under contract to WWE. Not bad. Not bad for a guy who did a whole lot of nothing. And I can't even remember the last time JTG had a match. I've said this before. I mean, you read house show reports. I don't know the last time this guy wrestled a match anywhere for WWE. Not in a dark match, at a house show, on the European tour, even an NXT taping, nothing. He's just been sitting at home collecting a paycheck, I guess. What more can be said? I mean, they weren't doing anything with the guy. It was inevitable that he was going to be cut. How can we sit here and say, oh, that's such an unfair cut? Yeah, you could say they could have done more with him. Realistically, he was only going to get to a certain level. I didn't see him above a certain level. They could have done more with him, but they didn't. And so if you're not using the guy, get rid of him. If anything, I think he was under contract a lot longer than he should have been. Camacho. Camacho is the son of Haku. One of them, anyway. I think his other son or sons wrestle over in Japan, I think. This was a little surprising in that he's been used a lot more often lately on NXT. He just got done his little feud with Adam Rose, which, in all honesty, bored me to tears. I can't really say that what they were doing with him was all that exciting, but I guess what was surprising about it was, again, he kind of did branch off on his own. He had size. He had a good look. He was in good shape. They just never had anything meaningful for the guy, and again, if they have nothing meaningful for him, then the best thing is probably just to get rid of him and cut the fat, and that's what they did with Camacho. And his fate may have been sealed once Hunico took over the Sin Cara character. They had a good thing going with Hunico and Camacho, and at a time when they need more tag teams, they could have used them, but he's off doing the Sin Cara gimmick, and there was really nothing left for Camacho. Brodus Clay. Brodus Clay has been with WWE for a number of years. If you recall, he came in. First meaningful thing they did with him was pair him off with Alberto Del Rio and Ricardo Rodriguez. He was Alberto's heavy, his bodyguard. This goes back to 2011. And I liked him in that role. That was probably the best role for him, was being this intimidating beast of a man who can watch your back. And it's not really all that different than what he was doing before he came to WWE. At one time, he was, I believe, Snoop Dogg's real-life bodyguard. So in a lot of ways, it was the perfect role for him. And then, if you recall, they were getting ready to debut him. They kind of branched him off on his own. They were going to debut him as this big monster, John Laurinaitis. I mean, there were promos that aired for him. Brodus Clay is coming. And he had already debuted on TV, but they were reintroducing him. And they reintroduced him as the Dancing Funkasaurus. And I was one of the few people at the time who actually liked the gimmick and wanted to give it a chance. I thought it had potential. I thought that it could get over and he could sell a lot of merchandise. And I said the way to handle it is you got to be very careful, because if he just becomes a comedy character and nothing more, then he's doomed. But if you handle it in a way where when he gets slapped or he gets punched and he really gets pissed off, he snaps, he's got a mean streak, and he just tears his opponent to shreds. And they never did that. They never went in that direction. They played it for straight comedy. He came out with the Funkadactyls. He danced. I remember at first when he was doing the gimmick, it may have happened a couple of times, but he had problems ripping off his rip-away pants, and it was kind of embarrassing. Eventually, they transitioned him into a team with Tenzai. They became the Dancing Fat Guys, and I guess that kind of worked for them for a while. Again, never did anything meaningful, never wrestled for the tag team titles or anything like that. They did the split. Tenzai became an announcer, and actually I think does a pretty good job at it, and I think he could even improve. So he's off doing his thing, doing the announcing, and there really was no role left for Brodus Clay. The most recent thing that he did was they brought him over to NXT to help put over Adrian Neville, kind of like what they're doing now with Tyson Kidd. They don't have any plans for these guys. They're just bringing them over so a guy like an Adrian Neville, who does have a lot of potential and who they hopefully do have plans for and see a future in, can get over really at the expense of them. So it's not that they see any sort of value in a Tyson Kidd or a Brodus Clay. They serve a certain role, and that's what they brought him in to do. And to be perfectly honest with you, the matches with Adrian Neville, I think they had 2 of them. They really weren't very good. He just wasn't that good. I mean, he's been around for a number of years. He never really improved to the point where I would say, okay, you know what? He's really good in the ring. He's good for a guy of his size. He's good for a big guy. Maybe in small doses. Maybe they could have booked him a little bit differently as this big monster who doesn't have long matches. But they would put him in there. He just wasn't that good. So what do you do with a guy like that? The Funkasaurus killed any chance of a serious run for the guy. I mean, that's it. He was the Funkasaurus for so long that it just killed any chance of people taking him seriously. And there was something there. I remember right after he did the heel turn, he broke away from Tenzai. Of all things, I think it was a Miz TV segment on Main Event. They didn't even air it on Raw. It was on Main Event on Ion Television, but he had a really good promo. He came out in a suit, he had the bling around his neck and all that, and I remember he cut a really good promo. So they could have done something with him, but again, like a Camacho, he was never going to go above a certain level. It just wasn't going to happen. So he's already booked a trip to Japan for himself. Not to wrestle, although he is open to wrestling over there, he said, but there was a TMZ story that said he's heading over to Japan to protest dolphin hunting. He's been passionate about it ever since he saw a documentary about it called The Cove, and so he's heading over there. His main focus is bringing awareness to the cause of the dolphins. So good for him. You know, I say thumbs up on that. I hope that works out for him. Evan Bourne. Evan Bourne is an interesting cut. Evan Bourne has been under contract at WWE for the last 2 years, although you would never know it because I think it's been about 2 years, maybe 2.5 years since we last saw him on television. He had a couple of wellness policy suspensions. I think the rumor was it was for synthetic marijuana, although I don't think that was ever officially announced. But anyway, he got popped twice under the wellness policy, so that second time I think was a 60-day suspension. Somewhere in there, he was in a really bad car accident, really fucked up his foot badly. I think he had surgery on it, maybe multiple times. Apparently, he's been healed up from that injury now for a while. I've read where he's been physically able to compete. He's been physically ready to come back for over a year, and they never brought him back. And I don't understand why. I don't know if they were just gun-shy, if they had it in their mind that they were going to wait and cut him, or if this was an impulse cut and they didn't have, any long-term plans to do it. They just kind of looked over the roster and said, you know what, we're not doing anything with this guy, let's get rid of him. I don't know what their mentality was with this cut. All I know is he's been healed up for a while, and he's been doing a whole lot of nothing. And obviously he had something. He was an exciting guy in the ring. I remember seeing him way back when I was first going to Ring of Honor shows, and he was Matt Sydal, or Sydal, I should say, and he was doing his thing, and he was awesome. For a guy his size, flying around the ring like that, doing things, he reminds me of Adrian Neville. Adrian Neville is known for his high-flying wrestling, and he does the Red Arrow, which is a spectacular move. Well, what came before that? It was Evan Bourne doing his deal and doing the shooting star off the top rope, and for a while there, he was getting a little bit of a push. I remember when he was teaming up with John Cena in a main event on Raw once. And the fans were into him. He was really likable. He had the Air Boom team with Kofi Kingston for a while. I think they won the belts. So obviously they could have done something with him, and it's kind of surprising only because he's been under contract for so long doing nothing. A guy like him would be a great pickup for a TNA or a Ring of Honor. I'd love to see him go back to Ring of Honor. That seems to be the pattern of late. A lot of guys who came from Ring of Honor who have gone to mostly TNA have been ending up back in ROH. AJ Styles, Christopher Daniels, Frankie Kazarian. I think there's somebody else who I'm missing. I'd love to see him go back there and tangle with some of those guys, Adam Cole and guys like that. TNA, people joke about TNA whenever they do these cuts. Oh, Dixie Carter's licking her chops. She can't wait to make, Camacho the next TNA World Heavyweight Champion. Wouldn't shock me. But at the same time, there are one or two guys who, if I'm TNA, I look at and say, these guys can contribute. We should try bringing them in. I don't even know if they could afford to bring in any of these guys with what's going on over there. But of all the guys who were cut, if we're putting the comedy and the jokes aside, Evan Bourne is one of those people who I think could be a good pickup for the X division in TNA, even though I'd probably prefer to see him go to ROH and just mix it up with those guys there. So I think he'll land on his feet. He'll end up somewhere where I'm sure, have kick-ass matches and everything, and hopefully he's all healed up from his injuries and he can have a rebirth for himself. Yoshi Tatsu is another one who I hope can have something of a career rebirth, because WWE completely just mishandled this guy from day one. He came over from Japan. He was supposedly making good money over there, doing well in Japan, but he had a dream to work for WWE. So he came over here probably for less money, went to NXT and wanted to learn the WWE style and the American way, and I don't remember them ever really doing anything with him. Maybe at first he won some matches, but it was so long ago. He's been with the company for so many years. And what ended up happening with Yoshi Tatsu is what happens with most foreign, or I should say Asian, talent. And I'm not sure why that happens, but he fell into this thing where, he doesn't know a lot of English, so, let's laugh at him as he bows. And, he came out to that wacky music, which I actually kind of liked, his theme music. But he had something. He was a good wrestler. And it's almost like they beat it out of him, because you watch him recently, he was on NXT a few times. He didn't look overly impressive. The crowd was into him like crazy. They were chanting Yoshi's name. Even on the most recent NXT, after we all found out he had been cut earlier that day, and again, this show was taped a few weeks ago, there were Yoshi Tatsu, random Yoshi Tatsu chants in the middle of one of the matches on the card. He wasn't even on the show. So, people were into him. They wanted to see him do well. I think they liked him. He seems like a likable guy. If you ever followed him on Twitter, he would post, stuff like, "Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody has a nice day." Like, he just comes off as such a nice guy. And the story from many months ago, which I think I mentioned here on the Sound Off, where there were reports that he had gone to management and said, "Listen, I want to move to Texas." He found a community of Japanese folks in Texas, and he wanted to, uproot himself and move there and be with other Japanese people. And he was told, "No, we're not going to let you go. You have to be here. You have to be in Orlando. You have to do your training exercises and your drills." Like, he was a rookie. He's been wrestling for years. So the idea that this guy is asking you, "Please, can I move to this community in Texas? And I guess I'll travel to Orlando and go back and forth and do what I have to do." And they just shot him down and said, "No, so important that you be here for these exercises so that you can learn, and we're not going to do anything with you, but we still want you here." I remember reading that and being so angry for the guy. Like, why? Just let him move. Well, you know what? Now he's not under contract anymore. Maybe it's the best thing for him. Now he can move wherever he wants. He can move to Texas. He can go back to Japan. He can do whatever he wants. And I really hope he lands on his feet and he does well for himself, because I think he got dealt a bad hand by WWE. I really do. I don't think he was ever given any sort of serious chance. I'm not saying Yoshi Tatsu could have one day been World Heavyweight Champion, but for God's sakes, he could have been a solid mid-card guy for them. He could have held one of the mid-card titles. He could have. And they never gave him a fair shake. So maybe this is the best thing for him. Curt Hawkins, one half of the former Edgeheads with Zack Ryder, who I'm sure was sweating bullets on Thursday. Curt Hawkins, we have not seen much of Curt Hawkins. I saw him for the first time in a long time a few weeks ago on NXT. They brought him in. Again, I think it was to work with Adrian Neville, if I remember correctly. Maybe it was Sami Zayn. I'm pretty sure it was Neville. They brought him in, and they had a match, and it was good. Hawkins is a good wrestler. Again, they just haven't done anything with him. And I heard that he opened up his own wrestling school recently, and he may not have cleared it with WWE, and so maybe there was some heat on him. I don't know how accurate that is, but I know he just opened his school. So it looks like he's already been planning for that next phase of his career, so I'm sure he'll be fine. Oksana, also cut by WWE, the Soul Diva, cut this past week. You can probably go back to the knee drop on Naomi. Maybe that sealed her fate, although they took a while. That was a few months ago. They didn't fire her right away, but that was bad. Just what happened to Naomi, you could say was a freak accident, but it was also, if you watch it, like, what was this woman thinking? It was like Naomi was going for a sunset flip, and Oksana just drove her knee right into her eye socket. She could have gone blind from an injury like that. And it probably cost Naomi the Divas title. If the reports around that time are to be believed, she was in line for a match with AJ Lee and was probably going to win the championship. and it was going to be part of this big Total Diva storyline where Naomi goes to WrestleMania and she wins the title and she realizes her dream. Obviously, that didn't happen, probably largely because of the injury from Oksana, which I'm sure was not intentional, but you can't be doing something like that. It was just completely reckless on her part. And again, they weren't doing anything with Oksana either. Oksana, there was nothing special about her. She was another blonde diva on the roster. She wasn't exceptional in the ring. I never thought she was really that good. I never saw the appeal in Oksana. They had plenty of other divas who were more capable, who I wish they would do more with, and they kind of have started to do that with Alicia Fox. So this wasn't really surprising. Maybe it was surprising in that she's had more TV time of late. Otherwise, not really very surprising at all. If anything, probably should have happened a long time ago. Teddy Long, done with WWE, 15 years in the company. He started out as a referee, transitioned over to a manager, and then eventually into the general manager role. And he's pretty much toiled as the GM of mostly SmackDown. I think for Raw, maybe for a time. He's gone back and forth for like the last 10 years doing the GM stuff. And you kind of get to that point where it's played out. It's like, what role is there for Teddy Long on TV? I don't see one. Because I am not a fan of the GM positions anyway. I wish they would just abolish them and do away with them, especially if you've got Triple H and Stephanie, we're the authority, and they're flexing their muscle, they're making decisions, they're making matches. I don't see the point of having a GM on either show. If he's not going to be the GM, then what's he going to do? Is he going to manage somebody? I mean, who would he manage? And how effective would he really be in that role? Is he going to go back to being a referee? Probably not. Not at his age. I think he's in his mid-60s now. And apparently this was not a cut so much as his contract expired. So it was this mutual parting of the ways, and he is no longer with WWE. And don't be surprised if he gets inducted into the Hall of Fame next year. And that's not anything I've read. That's just me speculating. I think, it didn't end on bad terms. He had a long run with the company. He is a legend in the business. Go back before he went to WWE. He was doing stuff in WCW. And, he's a name that goes back 20, 25 years, not just from his time in WWE. Certainly, you can make the argument deserving of a Hall of Fame induction for his body of work. Would not be at all surprised if he ends up in the Hall of Fame next year. Referee Mark Harris, the one sole referee who was cut this past Thursday. If you remember, he was the referee who was involved. It was a really, I don't know if it was botched, it was a really weird finish to a Natalya match on Raw last summer. So this goes back almost a year. And what happened was, everybody blamed the referee for it. I may have blamed the referee for it. It looked like it was his fault. I don't know if it was or not. But he took offense to this. He went on Twitter, this Twitter tirade, shooting down this idea that it was his fault. And I guess the former referee for WWE, Jimmy Korderas, he may have made a comment that pissed off Mark Harris, and Mark Harris, I think, went off on Jimmy Korderas on Twitter. So supposedly he may have still had some heat for that incident last summer. I don't know that that's exactly what led to his being cut, because, again, that was almost a year ago. But then again, WWE has not had very many, if any, cuts unless somebody did something wrong. If they violated some sort of company policy and they fired them. It's been a long time since WWE had this mass firing, this mass cutting of talent. So maybe they were just waiting. Maybe they were waiting for the next big mass cutting of talent to lump him in there with everybody else, and he's had heat this whole time. I don't know. But I wasn't surprised to hear of all the referees that he was the one who got cut. Not surprising at all. What was surprising to me was the cutting of 3MB, and in particular the cutting of Drew McIntyre. Now, Heath Slater is still under contract. He's still there. I know he's very well liked. Obviously, they trust him. I mean, if you remember, Heath Slater was the guy who almost exclusively worked with Bret Hart back in 2010 when they did the Nexus angle. It's like every time there was some sort of face-off on TV between the Nexus and Team WWE, and they did the big tag match at SummerSlam, Bret almost exclusively worked with Heath Slater. Slater took bumps for him. Heath is the one who worked with all those legends leading up to Raw 1000. They would trot out Vader one week and Psycho Sid another week. I think he even worked a match with Lita one week. So they trust him. He's well liked. So I'm not surprised they kept him, but they let go of Jinder Mahal, which is not really that surprising. Drew McIntyre is the one that surprised me the most. I know it shouldn't, because they really haven't done anything with Drew in a long, long time. 3MB's been getting a lot more TV time of late. Poor Hornswoggle looks like got his head shaved for no reason, by the way. So 3MB's been on TV almost weekly. And they've been doing the angle with the Matadors and El Torito. So that caught me off guard that they would eliminate 2/3 of 3MB. Drew McIntyre, to me, is the most egregious cut in that it illustrates a guy who was completely wasted in his time with WWE. And I don't know what his situation is now, because I don't know if he's on a work visa and how that might affect him if he has to go back home to Scotland, or if he can stay here and find employment in a TNA or an ROH. I don't know. That could be a dicey situation for him in terms of the work visa stuff, so I don't know how that works. But, when Drew came in, let's go back a little bit here. Only in recent years was I aware of the work that he did in Florida. Before it became NXT, it was FCW, Florida Championship Wrestling. Steve Keirn was the booker and the head guy down there. And they had Sheamus was in developmental. Drew McIntyre was in developmental. They worked a lot of matches together. And I think the two of them were like best friends. They were always posting pictures together on Twitter. Kayfabe be damned, you'd see Sheamus and Drew McIntyre sharing a pint. So I'm sure it sucks for Sheamus that his friend got cut. But they worked together a lot in developmental. And again, Sheamus was the heel, Drew McIntyre was the babyface. And I remember seeing a match on YouTube, and they probably had multiple matches. But whatever the main title was down there was like the FCW, what was it, that Jack Briscoe 15 title or something like that. Drew was the champion. And I'm watching this match and I'm thinking, this is a damn good match. And this is a side of Drew McIntyre that we never really got to see on the main roster. He was really good. But that goes back years when he was in developmental. So they finally bring him up, and they have him endorsed on television by no greater authority than Vince McMahon himself. Vince comes out and says, I proclaim this guy to be the chosen one. It's like, here's Vince McMahon's stamp of approval. This guy's going places. And he won the Intercontinental title. He kind of gave off this young Triple H vibe. He was good. He was really good. The accent was a little weird in terms of his cutting promos. I mean, I could understand what he was saying and all that, but it could be tough. It could be tough for somebody with an accent to cut promos and for people to get into them, because that's just the way that we as fans are conditioned. That's why I think Adrian Neville may have a really tough time when he makes it up to the main roster. That's going to be, I think, for him, besides his size, that's going to be one of the biggest obstacles. But, aside from that, McIntyre had it, man. I mean, he really could have been somebody big. And he seemed to have all the right people backing him. And then I know there were some issues with him and Taryn Terrell, the former Tiffany. Remember when Tiffany was the ECW GM? So they were married at the time, and I think they got caught because they got into a fight. I think Tiffany attacked him, and they were at a Playboy Mansion party. And again, PG WWE, you don't want to get caught at a Playboy party. And TMZ picked it up, and I think that was a big embarrassment for him, and he had some heat for that. I can't believe, though, that was years ago. And the idea that he would still be carrying around some sort of heat or bad blood, and that's why they never seriously pushed him again after that. And again, he and Taryn Terrell got a divorce. They're not together anymore. There had to be another reason. There had to be something else. Maybe he had an ego and he walked around backstage and rubbed people the wrong way, had a chip on his shoulder. I don't know. But it's almost like a Dolph Ziggler situation where you have this guy who clearly has the talent, he has the tools, he can be something, maybe even a world champion one day, and for whatever reason, you just don't do anything with him. If he did something so wrong and so heinous, then just fire him. You should have gotten rid of him years ago, but they didn't. They kept him around. They just never pushed him. And I think that was a big mistake. I think of all the people who were cut, he jumped out at me as the one that made me the most, it kind of like made me shake my head more than any of the other cuts. The other cuts were not completely unexpected. This one was, in that I really thought at some point maybe they would try to do something with him. I think he was probably so badly damaged by the 3MB comedy stuff that he never was going to get above a certain level. But that's their fault. That's their fault for putting him in that position. He never should have been part of that act in the first place. They should have plugged somebody else in there and actually pushed the guy as a serious contender for the U.S. title, the Intercontinental title, and just see what you can do with him, and they never did that. That's not Drew's fault. That's on WWE, and I think that was a big mistake.